I never expected my life to take a turn like this. Just a few months ago, I was content living my usual routine, work, home, the occasional night out with friends. But everything shifted the moment she walked into my world with that mischievous smile and a sparkle in her eye that promised change. She had a way of noticing the smallest details about me, the quirks I thought were invisible, the subtle way I admired feminine things from afar. It started innocently enough, with her teasing me about my thrift store blouses and the way I lingered in the makeup aisle longer than anyone would admit. At first, I laughed it off, chalked it up to her playful nature, but deep down, a quiet thrill stirred inside me. One evening, she invited me over under the guise of helping her organize her closet. I didn't think much of it, after all, we were close friends. But when I stepped inside, the room was transformed. Dresses in soft pastels and deep velvets hung meticulously on racks, and shelves glimmered with neatly lined shoes and accessories. She looked at me with that same spark and said, "I think it's time you see yourself the way I see you." My heart raced, and I didn't quite know what she meant. She handed me a delicate dress, the fabric soft and strange against my fingers, and encouraged me to try it on. Hesitation warred with curiosity. As I slipped into the outfit, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror and froze. The reflection staring back was both unfamiliar and intoxicating. My chest felt lighter, my posture shifted, and even my expression softened. She moved behind me, adjusting the dress and brushing my hair into a style I didn't recognize on myself. When she finished, she stepped back and smiled, almost as if she'd unlocked a hidden version of me that had been waiting all along. "You look incredible," she whispered, but it wasn't just about the dress. It was about the transformation, the subtle unveiling of a side of me I hadn't dared to explore. And that night, as I walked home in the outfit, the reflection in store windows and streetlights seemed to confirm it. I was changing, and I couldn't tell yet if it was frightening or liberating. The quiet thrill I had felt earlier had grown into a pulse of anticipation. Something was shifting, and I knew life as I'd known it was about to be redefined. The next day, I woke up with a strange mix of excitement and unease. The memory of that dress, the way it felt, and her approving gaze lingered in my mind like a whisper I couldn't ignore. I tried to go about my routine as usual, but even mundane tasks felt different. Walking past mirrors, I caught myself straightening my posture, unconsciously imagining how I might look in a soft skirt or a pair of heels. It was as though a door had opened inside me that I didn't know existed. Later, she called and asked if I wanted to come over again. Her tone was casual, but I could hear the undercurrent of mischief, the same energy that had drawn me in the first time. When I arrived, she had something new waiting, a set of delicate, satin gloves, a small handbag, and a pair of shoes that seemed both intimidating and alluring. She smiled knowingly as she laid everything out. "Today," she said, "we're upgrading your role." I hesitated, my mind swirling. Upgrading? What did that even mean? She gestured toward the mirror, and I watched as she carefully guided me into each piece. The gloves slid over my fingers, the shoes clicked against the floor, and the dress hugged me differently than before, emphasizing curves I hadn't realized I had. She stepped back, her eyes appraising, and said softly, "You're more than just a helper now." Her words sent a shiver down my spine. I felt exposed and protected at the same time, like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, but someone was holding my hand. As the afternoon passed, she taught me subtle movements, how to walk, how to carry myself, even how to hold a teacup, so that it looked graceful. Each instruction felt intimate and precise, like a secret language I was slowly learning. There was a strange power in the way she guided me, a gentle authority that I couldn't resist. And somewhere between the laughter, the corrections, and the careful attention, I realized that I wasn't just playing dress-up anymore. I was stepping into a new identity, one that felt as real as my own reflection, yet entirely different from the person I had been just days ago. By the time I left that evening, I felt a strange sense of anticipation for the next encounter. I knew she would continue to push me, to refine this version of myself she had discovered. And deep inside, I felt an unfamiliar but undeniable excitement at the thought of it. Something had shifted irreversibly, and I couldn't wait to see how far it would go. Over the next few weeks, our sessions became a kind of ritual. Each time I arrived, she had something new prepared for me. Different dresses, shoes, hairstyles, even little accessories that seemed to subtly change the way I felt about myself. I began to notice small shifts in the mirror, things I hadn't seen before. The curve of my waist, the softness of my features, the way my movements felt lighter, more deliberate. It wasn't just the clothing. It was the transformation of how I carried myself, how I existed in the world. One evening, she surprised me with a mirror I hadn't noticed before. It was taller than any I'd seen, stretching from floor to ceiling, reflecting not just my body, but the space around me. She asked me to step forward and really look at myself. My heart thumped as I did. The reflection was mesmerizing, not just a costume or an outfit, but a version of me that seemed alive, aware, and present in a way I hadn't imagined possible. "This," she said, her voice soft, "is the future version of you, the one you've been too hesitant to meet." I laughed nervously, unsure if I was ready for that kind of honesty, but she just smiled and guided me further. She showed me how to hold my head, how to tilt my chin, how a simple gesture could completely change the impression I made. I began to understand that this wasn't about pretending. It was about revealing something that had always been inside me, hidden under layers of doubt and routine. Each day, each adjustment, each careful suggestion chipped away at my old self, revealing a new identity that felt fragile, yet exhilaratingly powerful. One night, as I walked home, the city lights reflected in the puddles from a recent rainstorm. I caught my reflection and froze for a moment, realizing I wasn't just seeing my face, I was seeing the person I could become. And with that recognition came a strange, thrilling vulnerability. I felt exposed, but in a way that wasn't frightening, it was liberating. The idea that someone could guide me this way, that I could explore this side of myself without judgment, made my pulse quicken. I realized that I wanted more, not just more outfits or accessories, but more transformation, more guidance, more of this experience that made me feel alive in a way nothing else had. By the time I reached my apartment, I was quietly shaking with anticipation. I didn't know how far I would go, but I knew, deep in my chest, that this journey wasn't ending anytime soon. She had opened a door, and I was ready to walk through it. Over the next few weeks, our sessions became a kind of ritual. Each time I arrived, she had something new prepared for me. Different dresses, shoes, hairstyles, even little accessories that seemed to subtly change the way I felt about myself. I began to notice small shifts in the mirror, things I hadn't seen before. The curve of my waist, the softness of my features, the way my movements felt lighter, more deliberate. It wasn't just the clothing. It was the transformation of how I carried myself, how I existed in the world. One evening, she surprised me with a mirror I hadn't noticed before. It was taller than any I'd seen, stretching from floor to ceiling, reflecting not just my body, but the space around me. She asked me to step forward and really look at myself. My heart thumped as I did. The reflection was mesmerizing, not just a costume or an outfit, but a version of me that seemed alive, aware, and present in a way I hadn't imagined possible. "This," she said, her voice soft, "is the future version of you, the one you've been too hesitant to meet." I laughed nervously, unsure if I was ready for that kind of honesty, but she just smiled and guided me further. She showed me how to hold my head, how to tilt my chin, how a simple gesture could completely change the impression I made. I began to understand that this wasn't about pretending. It was about revealing something that had always been inside me, hidden under layers of doubt and routine. Each day, each adjustment, each careful suggestion chipped away at my old self, revealing a new identity that felt fragile, yet exhilaratingly powerful. One night, as I walked home, the city lights reflected in the puddles from a recent rainstorm. I caught my reflection and froze for a moment, realizing I wasn't just seeing my face, I was seeing the person I could become. And with that recognition came a strange, thrilling vulnerability. I felt exposed, but in a way that wasn't frightening. It was liberating. The idea that someone could guide me this way, that I could explore this side of myself without judgment, made my pulse quicken. I realized that I wanted more, not just more outfits or accessories, but more transformation, more guidance, more of this experience that made me feel alive in a way nothing else had. By the time I reached my apartment, I was quietly shaking with anticipation. I didn't know how far I would go, but I knew, deep in my chest, that this journey wasn't ending anytime soon. She had opened a door, and I was ready to walk through it. One weekend, she invited me to spend the day at her apartment under the pretense of a special makeover session. When I arrived, the atmosphere was different. Softer lighting, music that felt gentle but commanding, and an array of outfits carefully laid out like a display in a boutique. She smiled when I stepped inside, and I immediately noticed the intensity in her gaze. Today, it wasn't just about dresses or shoes. It felt like she was preparing me for something bigger. She started with my hair, brushing it gently, smoothing it into a style that framed my face in a way that made me pause. I caught my reflection mid-step and felt a flutter of disbelief. I had been wearing her clothes for weeks, but this was something else. She guided me toward a mirror and asked me to tilt my head, lift my chin, and soften my gaze. At first, it felt awkward, even unnatural. But slowly, her corrections seeped into my movements until I started to see the reflection she saw. Poised, delicate, confident. Then came the dress she called the signature piece. It was a flowing gown in pale lavender, embroidered delicately at the bodice. The moment I stepped into it, the world seemed to hush. My shoulders felt lighter, my chest softer, my hips subtly accentuated. She helped me with the final touches, the gloves, the shoes, a small pendant that rested perfectly on my collarbone. She took a step back, her eyes sweeping over me like a painter admiring a newly finished canvas. "You're not just wearing the clothes anymore," she said softly. "You're becoming them. You're becoming her." Her words struck me in a way I hadn't expected. I felt a mixture of thrill and nervousness, a tug-of-war between excitement and fear. I realized this wasn't simply a hobby or a game, it was a profound shift in who I was allowed myself to be in the world. And as I looked into her eyes, I knew she recognized it too. That quiet affirmation, the unspoken acknowledgement of my transformation, made my chest tighten with something I couldn't name. As the day wore on, she led me through movements, gestures, and routines designed to refine the version of me that was emerging. Every step, every adjustment, every small correction was like a puzzle piece sliding into place. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, I caught my reflection in a full-length mirror and barely recognized the person staring back. The reflection was poised, delicate, almost ethereal, and it felt like home in a way that surprised me. I realized that this transformation wasn't about escaping who I had been. It was about discovering the person I was meant to be. A few days later, she suggested something that made my stomach twist with anticipation: a public trial. She explained it wasn't about performance or attention, but about stepping fully into the identity she had been helping me shape. I was nervous, terrified really, but the thought of experiencing that version of myself in the outside world also made my heart race in a way I hadn't felt before. She dressed me meticulously, more carefully than ever. Layers of delicate fabrics, the softest shoes that made my steps click in rhythm, and a hairstyle that framed my face just right. She studied me in the mirror, her fingers brushing along my shoulders to adjust posture, and whispered, "Today, the world sees her. Not the old you, the new you." Her words sent a shiver through me, but it wasn't fear. It was something heavier, more thrilling, like standing on the edge of a precipice and knowing I could fly. When we stepped outside, the cool air kissed my skin, and I realized that every glance felt electric. People weren't staring in judgment. They were noticing, but I didn't care. I felt present. Alive. I had never imagined that clothing and posture could carry such power, that stepping into a new self could make the world feel like a different place. She guided me through each step, each movement, whispering subtle reminders. Lift your chin. Relax your shoulders. Let your hands float. And as I followed her guidance, I began to understand just how deeply I had been shaped by her attention, by her belief in this new version of me. We wandered through the streets, stopping at a cafe she adored. I noticed how my reflection shimmered in the glass as we passed, how my hands felt lighter, how my chest seemed to rise with each breath. It was disorienting and intoxicating at once. I wasn't performing for anyone else. I was performing for myself and for the person she had helped me become. By the time we returned to her apartment, something had shifted irreversibly. The reflection I saw in the mirror wasn't just her idea, it was mine. I had tasted freedom in the shape of someone I had always longed to meet, and I couldn't forget it. Later that night, alone in my apartment, I studied my reflection. The excitement hadn't faded. If anything, it had grown. I realized that this transformation wasn't temporary. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one where I would continue to explore, grow, and embrace the version of myself I had once hidden away. And as I drifted off to sleep, a quiet thought settled in my mind. This journey was far from over. It was only just beginning, and I couldn't wait to see where it would take me. The following week, she called me with a hint of excitement in her voice. "I think it's time for a ceremony," she said, and I felt my heart skip. Ceremony? What did she mean? My mind raced, imagining everything from a playful celebration to something more symbolic. When I arrived at her apartment, I realized it was something in between, a ritual that marked a new stage in my transformation. The room was softly lit, candles flickering against the walls. A small table was set with delicate items, a teacup, a mirror, a tiny box that caught the light in a way that made my pulse quicken. She greeted me warmly, her eyes sparkling with mischief and something tender I couldn't quite name. "Today," she said, "we're going to formalize your new role." She paused, letting the weight of the words settle in. I felt nervous, but there was also a strange comfort in her tone, like I was stepping into a space I was always meant to inhabit. She guided me through each step carefully. I changed into a new outfit, one that felt more personal than any I had worn before. It wasn't just about appearance, it was about intention. The dress was soft, flowing, almost ceremonial, and as I adjusted it in front of the mirror, I realized how much I had grown. My movements were becoming natural, fluid, confident. She watched me with that familiar approving gaze, and a quiet warmth spread through me. Then came the small box. Inside was a delicate pendant, and she placed it around my neck. "This," she whispered, "represents your commitment to this journey, to embracing every part of who you are." I felt a lump in my throat. It wasn't just jewelry. It was a symbol, a tangible acknowledgement of the transformation that had been unfolding for months. As she adjusted it carefully, I noticed how my reflection seemed almost alive, as if the person staring back at me had finally been recognized. We spent the rest of the evening in quiet conversation and gentle guidance, practicing posture, gestures, and the subtle ways that made me feel complete in this new identity. By the time I left, the pendant rested against my chest, a constant reminder of the journey I had embarked on and the person I was becoming. Walking home, I felt an unfamiliar confidence. I knew the process wasn't over, that there were more layers to explore, more boundaries to push, but something had shifted profoundly. I wasn't just experimenting anymore. I was living this fully, unapologetically, and it was exhilarating. A few days later, she invited me for what she called an evening of refinement. My nerves buzzed with anticipation as I prepared. I had begun to understand that every session with her was more than just clothing or posture. It was an emotional and mental transformation, a delicate reshaping of the way I saw myself. Tonight felt different, though. There was a gravity to her invitation, a quiet intensity one couldn't ignore. When I arrived, she greeted me with a soft smile and led me to a corner of the apartment I hadn't noticed before. A small, full-length mirror leaned against the wall, and beside it was a chair and a small table with neatly arranged accessories. She gestured for me to sit, her hands gentle but purposeful as she began adjusting my hair and outfit. I noticed how the light fell across my reflection, highlighting subtle curves and lines that seemed almost new to me. I was no longer just seeing myself in a dress. I was seeing someone fully alive in this form, someone I could recognize as me. She guided me through movements I had been practicing for weeks. The tilt of my head, the sway of my hands, the way I shifted my weight from foot to foot. Each correction was precise, almost intimate, and I realized I was learning more than technique. I was learning to inhabit this self completely. Her voice was calm but firm, giving me direction without pressure, letting me explore, adjust, and embrace each movement. The process was exhausting and exhilarating at once, but I felt a growing confidence with every step. Then came a moment of silence. She stepped back, her eyes sweeping over me, and said softly, "Do you see her now? The version of yourself you've been nurturing?" I looked into the mirror, and for a long moment, I almost couldn't breathe. The reflection was fully me and yet entirely new, a delicate balance of vulnerability and strength, curiosity and confidence. My chest tightened, not with anxiety, but with the awe of recognition. I had reached a point where I no longer felt like I was wearing someone else's clothes. I was embodying this self, fully and consciously. By the time the evening ended, I was exhausted in the best way possible. My reflection lingered in my mind as I walked home, and I realized I had crossed a threshold. The transformation had become less about her guidance and more about my own willingness to embrace it, to live it. I didn't just feel different. I felt complete. And with that realization came a quiet, thrilling anticipation of what lay ahead. A week later, she called me with a tone that was unusually serious, yet gentle. "I think it's time we formalize something," she said. My stomach fluttered with a mix of excitement and nerves. Over the past months, everything had been a gradual unfolding, gentle nudges, playful guidance, small rituals. But now it felt like she was inviting me to step fully into a new chapter. When I arrived, the apartment was arranged differently. Candles flickered softly, and the air smelled faintly of vanilla. On a small table lay a set of items I hadn't seen before, a delicate ribbon, a miniature bouquet of flowers, and a tiny set of rings. I froze, unsure what each symbol meant, but she smiled knowingly. "Tonight," she said, "we mark your transition. You're no longer just exploring. You're committing to this path, your path." She guided me to a chair and began preparing me for the ritual. The outfit she chose was the most elegant yet, the softest silk dress, flowing in gentle layers, complemented by shoes that clicked delicately against the floor. As she adjusted each piece, I noticed the quiet reverence in her movements. It wasn't just about making me look beautiful, it was about honoring the person I was becoming. When I looked in the mirror, I felt an unfamiliar but profound certainty. The reflection wasn't simply a version of me wearing her clothes. It was me fully inhabiting this identity. She stepped closer, gently placing the ribbon around my wrist, then handing me the tiny bouquet. "Symbols," she explained softly. "They remind you of who you are and the journey you've undertaken." Then came the rings. She held one carefully, her eyes meeting mine. "This is more than jewelry," she said. "It's a promise to yourself, to this self you've nurtured, and to me, your partner in this journey." My hands shook as I accepted it. Placing it on my finger felt like a declaration, a visible acknowledgement of a transformation that had been months in the making. For the first time, I felt fully aligned, not just in appearance, but in heart, mind, and spirit. When the ritual ended, I walked home slowly, the weight of the symbols light on my body, but immense in meaning. I realized that this journey wasn't just about clothes, posture, or reflection. It was about embracing a new identity, claiming it, and celebrating it. And for the first time, I understood that transformation isn't a single moment. It's a series of choices, small rituals, and acknowledgments that accumulate until they become who you are. After that evening, everything began to feel different, even in the simplest moments. Walking down the street, standing in front of a mirror, or even just sitting at home, I noticed subtle changes in the way I carried myself. It wasn't just the dresses, the shoes, or the carefully curated gestures. It was the confidence that had seeped quietly into my bones. I felt seen, not just by her, but by myself. She invited me over again, and this time there was a different energy in the air. She explained that today was about celebration, about embracing the journey we had undertaken together. I entered her apartment, heart fluttering with excitement, and found it decorated with soft lights and flowers. On a table, there was a small cake, delicate and elegant, and beside it a handwritten note, "For the one who has discovered her true self." I felt my chest tighten, a mixture of joy, pride, and awe. She guided me through the final touches of my attire, the dress flowing effortlessly around me, the shoes perfectly fitted, and my hair falling softly in place. Then she took my hands and said, "Look at yourself. Really look. This is the you you've fought to discover." I turned to the mirror, and for a long moment, I didn't speak. The reflection was powerful yet gentle, familiar yet entirely new. I saw every step of the journey reflected there, the nervous laughter, the careful guidance, the rituals, and now the quiet, confident strength of someone fully realized. We spent the evening in conversation and quiet laughter, sharing stories and reflections on how far I had come. I realized then that the transformation had never been about the clothes or even the rituals themselves. It had been about trust, about opening myself to guidance, and allowing myself to explore and accept a side of me I had never embraced before. And in that moment, I felt a profound sense of completion. Not the end of a journey, but the arrival at a place where I could fully inhabit the self I had been discovering. By the time I left, I carried with me not just the symbols, but a sense of identity that had solidified. I walked through the streets with a quiet confidence, aware of the reflection in every window, every passing glance, and every shadow. I realized that transformation is not just external, it is deeply internal, a reshaping of thought, feeling, and self-recognition. And for the first time, I felt truly at home in my own skin, ready for whatever the next chapter might bring. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't experienced before. The rituals, the guidance, the symbols, they weren't just moments of play or experimentation. They were stepping stones, each one carefully leading me to this point, fully embracing the identity I had once kept hidden, quietly, in the back of my mind. I dressed deliberately, choosing an outfit that felt entirely like me and caught my reflection. The image staring back was no longer tentative, uncertain, or exploratory. It was confident, serene, and completely at home in itself. When I returned to her apartment later that day, she greeted me with her familiar smile, but there was something different in her eyes too, a recognition of what had been accomplished, a subtle pride in the journey we had shared. She led me to the mirror, and for the first time, I realized that it wasn't just about her guidance anymore. The reflection was mine, entirely mine. Every movement, every gesture, every detail of how I carried myself was no longer a lesson to be learned, but an expression of who I was. We spent the afternoon in quiet conversation, recounting the journey, laughing at the early moments of hesitation and awkwardness, and marveling at the subtle changes that had accumulated into something remarkable. She handed me a small, polished mirror, and I realized it was a gift, not for how I looked, but for how I now saw myself. Holding it, I understood that transformation isn't a single instant or a sudden revelation. It's the accumulation of choices, courage, and trust. It's about opening yourself to new possibilities, allowing guidance to shape you, and finally accepting that the person you've discovered is real, valid, and complete. As I left that evening, I walked with a steady rhythm, fully aware of the reflection that met me in every window, every polished surface, every passing glance. I felt a profound sense of belonging to myself, a quiet triumph that was entirely internal, yet impossible to ignore. The journey had started with curiosity and teasing, evolved through rituals and guidance, and culminated in something far greater than appearances. It became the recognition and acceptance of my true self. I realized then that the story was never about clothes, mirrors, or symbols alone. It was about trust, exploration, and the courage to embrace transformation in every form. And in that moment, I knew one thing clearly. I had arrived, fully, unapologetically, as the person I had always been waiting to become.